You're listening to the podcast series Introducing the Tanakh with Brooke Lester. This episode is Law, Part A, Collections and Genres. This episode is on the subject of law in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. I almost have misgivings about doing a lecture on the subject of law, although it's just completely unavoidable and a fascinating topic in its own right, simply because law, especially in the history of Christian interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, law is often set over against grace, with the idea that the Old Testament is a book of law, whereas the New Testament is a book of grace. As if the New Testament texts solely considered God's loving invitation to humans to share in covenant, extended through God's unconditional love, and as if the Old Testament only concerned claims or demands that God makes upon people in that covenant. In other words, that the New Testament must contain nothing of the demands or expectations or call or claims that God makes upon humans in the covenant that they find themselves in through Jesus Christ. And as if the Hebrew Bible contained nothing of God's loving invitation, God's call to humans, made unconditionally to enjoy God's love in covenant. I suspect at some time I'm going to have to create an episode on grace in the Old Testament, maybe even a seminar along those lines on the way towards creating such an episode. But in the meantime, I think that a look at law in the Hebrew Bible will be sufficient to challenge some presuppositions that many, especially Christian or secular readers of the Hebrew Bible might have regarding law in the Old Testament. And if nothing else, show some of the great variety that exists in the Old Testament regarding law and the stance of the Old Testament texts themselves toward that law. The Hebrew Bible contains three major blocks of legal material, three legal codes, as well as other legal material. The codes are the Book of the Covenant, or the Covenant Code, as found in Exodus 20 to 23, the Deuteronomic Law Code, Deuteronomy 12 to 26, and the Holiness Code in Leviticus 17 to 26. And then we'll find that there's other legal material, including the Decalogues, with which we must include a cultic decalogue that we'll look at in Exodus 34, and a variety of remaining priestly legislation. So let's begin with the major blocks of legal materials, the legal codes. The first code, the Covenant Code, is found in Exodus 20, beginning with verse 22 and extending to chapter 23, verse 33. Briefly, what stands out about this code is that it seems to primarily envision an agricultural society, and a fairly decentralized agricultural society at that. That is, legal decision and power seems to be in the hands of male propertied heads of household to whom this law code is addressed, and there is not envisioned a centralized state authority from which judgments might arrive. Rather, judgments are hammered out in the community among these male propertied heads of household on the basis of precedent. For these reasons, the Covenant Code is considered by many to be an old law code that may predate the monarchical period in the history of the people Israel. The Deuteronomic Law Code, by contrast, Deuteronomy 12 through 26, absolutely is set during a monarchical period, and the fact that it shares many concerns in common with the Josianic reform, the reform movement of King Josiah in the 7th century, as narrated in 2 Kings 22 and 23, and as reflected in the Deuteronomistic history generally, This law code is normally set during Josiah's time, and in fact is considered to be a part of the core of Deuteronomy that is found by the high priest in the renovations of the temple and presented to Josiah, narrated in 2 Kings 22, and which becomes the foundation, the starting point of the Josianic reform movement, including the centralization of the cult, and which is the setting of the first redaction of the Deuteronomistic history. The first several chapters of this Deuteronomic law code concern the centralization of the cult, and we have to remember what an innovative move that would have been to suddenly decide that all of the Yahweh shrines that dot the countryside ought to be closed down, and the sacrificial worship of Yahweh restricted to a single location, the temple in Jerusalem. This would involve many other laws that would have to be made because of all the new circumstances attending this innovation. For example, remember that people are supposed to sacrifice to Yahweh every time they slaughter an animal for meat. Well, this becomes completely impracticable after a Josianic reform movement with its centralization of the cult, because you can't have people make a trip to the Jerusalem every single time they decide to eat meat. Therefore, this law code will allow for the secularization of slaughter, for example. That is, it will provide for people to slaughter their animals without making the requisite sacrifice to Yahweh, which now can only be made at the temple. It also includes sections on the king and what is expected of the king, on the institution of prophecy and how one knows true prophets from false prophets. All of these institutions, the monarchy, prophecy, the temple, these all are appropriate to a centralized monarchical state in a way that is that we don't find in the covenant code of Exodus. Later on in this episode, I'll do a little bit more of a detailed comparison between the covenant code and the Deuteronomic code. Thirdly, there's the holiness code in Leviticus 17 to 26. This is related to the priestly material, although not from P, the priestly writer of the Pentateuch. Most interpreters see the holiness code as one of the priestly sources available to the priestly writer in his redaction of the Pentateuch, alongside of his genealogies and calendars and descriptions of ritual, and of course alongside the J.E. narrative. All of these things going into the priestly redactor's creation of what we know as the Pentateuch. Some, instead, would see the holiness code as coming later than the priestly writer, and in fact, as I understand it, would rather see the priestly material being a source in the hands of this later holiness writer, who would be something more like the later redactor associated with the Pentateuch. The content of the holiness code is basically the laws that the people must follow in order to avoid polluting the land to which they have been promised and in which they dwell. Remember, from the priestly standpoint, you may recall this from study of the Pentateuch. From the priestly standpoint, sins and offenses, the breaking of law, the main problem of these are that they pollute the sancta, they pollute the tabernacle or the temple to the point that the continuing presence of God's holiness to the people is threatened. And the sacrificial cultus is the means by which those sins are atoned for, such that God can remain present in the temple to the people. The holiness code seems to work similarly, looking at the offenses by which the people pollute not only the sancta, but the land as a whole. Other legal material that we find in the Hebrew Bible besides these three large codes? Well, one omission you may have noticed already. Where are the decalogues? The decalogues are not included in these law codes, although they are narratively set so as to precede them in the final form of the Pentateuch. So one of our decalogues, or 10 commandments, is Exodus 20, 1 through 17, set to precede the covenant code. And the other decalogue is at Deuteronomy 5, verses 6 through 21, set at some distance to precede the Deuteronomic law code of Deuteronomy 12 to 26. In a short while, we will look at at some of the differences, the minor but significant differences we see between these two decalogues. Another decalogue, Exodus 34:10 through 26, a decalogue utterly different from the 10 commandments that you are used to. In this decalogue, some of the language is thoroughgoingly Deuteronomistic. You shall not, Exodus 34:15, you shall not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land when they prostitute themselves to their gods. Before that, in 12, you shall tear down their altars, break their pillars, and cut down their sacred poles. Thoroughly Deuteronomistic language there. In the context of a decalogue that has entirely to do with these ritual matters. 34:17, you shall not make cast idols, familiar at least in some form from the other decalogues. But then you shall keep the festival of unleavened bread is one of the commandments. All that opens the womb is mine. That is the firstborn of all livestock belong to the Lord, including, but the donkey you shall redeem with a lamb or else break its neck. There's the Sabbath commandment, 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh to rest, even in the plowing time and time of harvest, observing the Feast of Weeks, and appearing before the Lord 3 times a year at the major festivals, not offering the blood of the sacrifice with leaven, and so on. An entirely ritual or cultic decalogue. Fascinatingly, in the final form of the Pentateuch, this is set as the final draft of the covenant made through Moses with the people Israel. That is, Moses has broken the first tablets after seeing the golden calf, and this is set as the commandments that God writes on the second version of the tablets. The sense we get is of a final redactor who is going to considerable lengths to preserve different sources, as we've seen so many times in the Bible, the preservation of competing theological viewpoints in the wisdom literature, the preservation of dissenting views amidst the prophets, or certainly varying concerns among the prophets. The Deuteronomistic historian's preservation of sources whose theological claims and concerns are different from his own. The preservation of varying recollections of the creation traditions, of the Exodus traditions, of the flood traditions, and so on. And finally, there's a remaining priestly legislation includes Leviticus 1 through 16 with its descriptions of the priestly sacrifices in the tabernacle, and also Numbers 1 through 10 with its varying traditions about particular laws. It's often pointed out that we find law codes among Israel's neighbors, both before them and after them, in the ancient Near East. And one that comes up, for example, is the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi comes from about 1750 BCE and contains many close parallels to the Book of the Covenant and to other biblical law. You sometimes hear it said offhandedly that, many or most of the laws in the Hebrew Bible, come from the Code of Hammurabi. There are no quotes from the Code of Hammurabi, there's no reason to think that the law codes that we find in the Bible derive in some direct way from Hammurabi, that is, in the sense of borrowing. Nonetheless, not only are the concerns of the Code of Hammurabi shared with many of does it share many concerns with the law codes of the Hebrew Bible, but also its ways of sort of hammering out solutions and the literary form in which the laws are set, as we'll see as we continue the lecture. One interesting feature of the Code of Hammurabi is that, like the biblical law codes, it is set in something of a narrative context. That is, the law code may be seen to not so much function simply in its own right as a law code to which one might appeal when judging particular cases, but it serves a narrative context. The Code of Hammurabi is set on a monumental inscription, a stele, which begins with a narrative in which Hammurabi describes the god having taken him by the hand and made him king, a common way for usurpers to talk about the way that they came to the throne, and that the God made him king so that the strong should not harm the weak, and for the well-being of the oppressed. And so it's in the service of that mandate of justice and of the protection of the marginalized that the law code is set. Additionally, the earthly king, by ruling according to the precepts of this law code, the earthly king imitates the compassion of the divine king, who is also described as a shepherd. Just as the God is a shepherd over the people, so is the earthly king to be a shepherd over the people. If you've heard the lecture on the royal theology, this ought to ring bells for you. The imitation of the earthly king imitating the divine king as an adopted son imitates the father. Other ancient law codes that come up from time to time in discussing the Hebrew Bible laws are the Sumerian code of Ur-Nammu, U-R-N-A-M-M-U, circa 2100 BCE. And from a little bit later, early in the second millennium BCE, the codes of Lipit Ishtar and the Eshnunna law codes. And a little later, in the latter half of the second millennium, the Hittite code. In just a moment, I'll be describing different kinds of law that we find in the Hebrew Bible. And at this point, I would simply point out that each of these law codes is characterized by every type of law, although mostly casuistic law or case law, and also capital law, that is death penalty law. And simply, in all of their details, simply fascinating for not only for their similarities to the biblical law codes, but also to for their differences from the biblical law codes. Each of these, Ur-Nammu, Lipit Ishtar, Eshnunna, and the Hittite code, easily found in translation in such works as Context of Scripture, a 3-volume work that organized according to genres of literature. It's translations of ancient Near Eastern literature that bears some relation in biblical studies. And also just Google. If you Google any of these, you'll find fairly reliable information, at least as a starting point, on these law codes and some translations of their content. What kinds of law do we find in the Pentateuch? What are the different types? You'll already know the concern that this series has with form criticism, that is, with attending to literary genre and trying to understand what sorts of form and content are peculiar to a given genre, including a genre of law, and what social historical settings a particular genre arises from and what its function is in that setting. So, for example, there is a kind of law we find in the Hebrew Bible in which a command or prohibition is made without any kinds of conditions upon it. For example, Exodus 23, verses 12 and 14. Verse 12 says, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th you shall rest. Verse 14 says, 3 times in the year you shall hold a festival for me. Now, in both cases, it goes on to say what the reasons are for this law, what one's motive is for doing this law. But there are no conditions on it. It doesn't say, if in a given year the rains are thus and so, then you shall come to me 3 times, or anything like that. Also, the 10 Commandments. You shall honor your father and mother. You shall not kill. And so forth. These unconditional laws we call apodictic law. Apodictic. Literally, that means something like from a dictum. That is, the law is simply laid down without conditions. The Decalogues consist mainly of apodictic commands. And in the Decalogue, as in these examples from Exodus 23, 12, and 14 that we just saw, one sometimes finds with this law type a motivational clause. A clause that describes one's motivation for obeying the command. Honor your father and mother so that it may go well with you in the land that you are about to enter. 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th rest. so that your ox and your donkey may have relief. I'll leave it as an exercise for the student, for example, to compare the motivational clauses found in the Sabbath law of the two decalogues. Exodus 20, verse 11, from the Covenant Code, but Deuteronomy 5, verse 15, for the Deuteronomic Code. Two different motivational clauses, each reflecting the concerns in the social historical setting of their respective law codes. Besides apodictic law, there's also casuistic law, or what you could call case law. Casuistic law it's in an if-then construction. If thus and so happens, then you shall do yada yada yada. Or when a man does thus and so, then you shall do etc. etc. These two parts are called the protasis and the apodosis. The protasis, if, and the apodosis, then. A good example showing some amount of internal development is found in Exodus 21, verses 35 and 36. If someone's ox hurts the ox of another person so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the price of it, and the dead animal they shall also divide. So they go even Steven in this example of one person's ox hurting the ox of another. They split the live beast and they split the dead beast. But, says verse 36, if it was known that the ox was accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has not restrained it, the owner shall restore ox for ox, but keep the dead animal. So there, it's not even Stevens. The person who has been offended gets an entire live ox, and the person who has failed to restrain his ox, who has been known to gore in the past, gets only the dead beast. Why? Because he should have ought to known better. Case law, and again here showing a development. We can imagine an original law that simply allowed for the goring of one ox by another and going even Steven. But then eventually a case comes along where it doesn't look like that works. Hey, this person's ox has gored in the past and he's done nothing about it. Even Stevens doesn't work here. So you have an additional amendment to the law, again in the if-then form. Finally, besides apodictic law and casuistic law, we have also capital law. Capital law, it's simply those laws in which whoever does thus and so shall be put to death. Exodus 21, verses 12 through 17, for example. Whoever strikes a person mortally shall be put to death. Whoever strikes father or mother shall be put to death. Whoever kidnaps a person shall be put to death. Whoever curses father or mother shall be put to death, and so on. Some would consider this a separate category. Some would lump it in as a special form of case law. That is, the idea is that it means effectively, if a person kidnaps, then you shall put him to death. But the form is presented apodictically. You know, whoever does this shall be put to death, without a sense of if-then, without a sense of conditions. So capital law tends to resist being neatly lumped in either to apodictic law or casuistic law, going to show that these are modern categories, not explicit in the Bible. The Bible law codes do not say, here are the apodictic laws, here are the casuistic laws, here are the capital laws, and they are not organized for the most part in these ways. Additionally, several particular laws will seem to mix the genres. A brief note on the history of biblical studies regarding the law that's appropriate here. Some, especially Alt, for example, Albrecht Alt, Alt believed that apodictic law was a distinctly Israelite innovation over against Israel's inheritance of casuistic law forms that it shares with its ancient Near Eastern neighbors. That is, for Alt, wherever we looked at casuistic law, this was the kind of law that Israel shared with its neighbors. But wherever we see apodictic law, this is a peculiarly Israelite form. And so we can imagine that these are peculiarly Israelite concerns in this apodictic law. He considered the apodictic law to reflect Israel's the unconditional nature of Israel's obligations to the stipulations of the covenant. This kind of scholarship comes from a time when it was considered to be terribly important to find out what is unique about Israel compared to its neighbors. That if we could isolate the things that Israel does not share with its neighbors, that would be what's theologically essential about the people Israel and their covenant with God. Whereas the things that it shares with its neighbors are considered to be, at best, a matter of indifference, and at worst, pollutions or perversions that it borrows from its neighbors. A very strange proposition when you really stop to think about it. That is, why is that which is unique to something considered to be what is really, really important to it? I am one of 4 siblings, of 4 children of my parents. But I don't think that I would say that it is only those things that I don't share with my brothers and sisters that are really what make me who I am. Certainly, many of the things that I share with my brothers and sisters are among those things that contribute to what makes me uniquely me. I think we would all recognize this on reflection, and yet we inherit this theological reflex of privileging theologically those things that Israel is thought not to share with its neighbors, and to wax apologetic about those things that it does share with its neighbors. Students in New Testament will see similar developments concerning the so-called search for the historical Jesus, in which things that Jesus is thought to share either with the Christianity that would develop from him or with the Judaism of which he is a part, these are considered to be a matter of indifference regarding what's really essential, and only those things that Jesus is thought not to share with either Judaism or Christianity are thought to be unique and somehow traceable to the historical Jesus. In both these cases, when this program is pushed to its logical end, you wind up with basically an Israel or a Jesus that dropped in from outer space with no relationship to the world of which it is a part. Recent scholarship has been much more willing to try to take the entirety of the literature and practices of the people Israel, both those it shares with its neighbors and those that we do not see that it shares with its neighbors, as part of the whole of the people Israel, and to be appreciated as a whole. In the second part of this episode, Law Part B, we will look at what some of the major concerns are of Israelite law. And we will also look in particular at some of the differences between the covenant codes and the Deuteronomic codes, simply because those codes share so much that their differences lend themselves for some scrutiny. And then finally, just a note on what some of the biblical what is the biblical attitude, if it can be discerned, toward the Torah. So please join me for the second part of Law.